Hello, this is Rocky Raccoon. Welcome to my channel. Super excited to do this video and have this started off. Great. I'm gonna just kind of break down this mugshot trend, why it's bad, that's like why I agree with some of the criticisms of it, and why I disagree with some of the criticisms of it, and specifically the ones that were lodged at James Charles and how he kind of really got the brunt of the criticism and not so much the TikTok stars that really perpetuated this trend and even, got him to want to do the trend in the first place. So first, what is this trend? So this trend is really a trend that started with mostly white teens on TikTok that decided to do this kind of a makeup challenge where they put on makeup that looks like bruises, a bloody nose, and pose for what they would title a mugshot. And that would be a trend. People, I think this lockdown is doing something to people. Like the amount of nonsense that I have seen on social media and this quarantine phase is literally baffling. And this is just one of those times. Anyway, so that's the trend. And, there's a huge wide array of people doing the same kind of look that honestly, if you really looked at it, is not very good. They're not very good at special effects makeup. Mostly it just kind of looks like they're slightly dirty. So they can't even do it well. But even when they do it, it doesn't really matter how you execute it, right? It's just, the concept of it is bad. So for one thing, it trivializes getting arrested. That's a serious thing. That's not something to laugh at, okay? Especially when, your mugshot is a picture of you, battered and bloodied. That means you had some kind of altercation. That means you've experienced some kind of violence. And oftentimes that violence is at the hands of police. And so for me, just seeing people make light of that by saying, oh, let me just put makeup on my face and just make this a thing. Make this a viral sensation, to me is very tone deaf and very much so belittles what that whole entire context can represent, because it's not just the putting on of the makeup to look like bruises and to be bloody, bloody nose and stuff, right? It's about the context of you looking like that for a mugshot. That's really the brunt of the criticism here, and that very much so is not something to make light of. There's added criticism to this that brings me to my second point of, it can be fun for you as a white person, as a younger person, well, specifically a younger white person, to put on this kind of makeup and fake a mugshot, because for you, it just never seems like it's going to be reality. So you are very distanced and removed from that image of people that look like you being bloodied and bruised. Especially since the majority of people that I have seen bloodied and bruised in a mugshot or bloodied and bruised going into jail have been, people of color. They haven't been people that look like me. They haven't been, people that look like the people in the TikToks. And so for me, and for a lot of people who, raise this kind of criticism, it's very much so something that speaks to their white privilege, that they can't even fathom that this is a reality for other people, that this image that they make of themselves being bloodied and bruised in a mugshot is a fantasy to them. It's not grounded in reality, when it is for so many other people of color. And that is so tone deaf, and very much so trivializing not only an issue that I think is serious enough, like going to jail and getting arrested, but it also definitely trivializes the plight of so many people of color. And this is not just a plight that people have endured, this is also a fear that people of color have on the day-to-day basis. And yet here you are saying that this is actually something that I can, make it look cool and make it a trend and make it look pretty. That just speaks to the lack of understanding and self-awareness, and just a lack of, thinking through what the implications of your actions are. And I don't want to be too harsh on these kids, because they're teenagers, and I don't want to be so mean. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater type of thing. But I do think there is some criticism to be had. And I'm glad a lot of them took it down and they heard the criticism, they did it, albeit quietly, and kind of moved on. And I'm glad they did that. I'm glad that was the decision they decided to make, because that was the best decision to make, and I hope that they learned something from this. But James Charles, very much so, wasn't as quick to take his pictures down, and he very much so dealt with the criticism a little bit more openly and with more questioning. And I kind of appreciate that, because I think he brought up some good points. I wanted to talk about the responses that he got, because it kind of brings into the forefront of this kind of conversation regarding PTSD triggers and how we kind of navigate the world with these things. And I think there's a lot of gray area with the kind of makeup and special effects work that kind of comes with depicting violence, and I think there's a conversation to be had there. So I kind of wanted to get into that. Before I get further into this discussion, I want to put some trigger warnings here with regards to, because I'll be talking about domestic violence and sexual assault, and so I kind of want people to be wary of that, and keep yourself safe. But yeah, so one of the interesting things that I thought about when seeing these responses, and kind of seeing what people were talking about in the Twitter replies in general, is that there's a lot of gray area with depictions of violence and whether or not we should depict them. And different types of violence are going to trigger people who have these types of experiences differently. And I really do think that's something people who are survivors and people who have experienced deep trauma, I think, need to kind of keep in mind. So why I bring this up is because in some of these replies and some of these, criticisms specifically given to James Charles, I saw a lot of projection. And why I can say that is because I have found myself in these similar types of situations as someone who is a person who has experienced sexual assault. I've definitely found myself putting my own worldview and experiences onto another person and assuming that is the best way to look at it, when I didn't really have any reasoning for that other than, well, that's what I experienced and that's that. There wasn't an argument for what I was trying to force upon people in my mind. I didn't really voice this at the time, but in my mind I was thinking, I think this is really weird. I don't really think that people should be thinking about it this way. Why can't they see it the way that I see it? And then I had to realize that basically the main reason that I was thinking that was not because there was something really nefarious going on and that there was actual implications to it, but rather it was me projecting my own trauma onto somebody else. And that was something I had to really take a step back and realize that I cannot impose that on other people. That doesn't mean that people should not be more cautious of the kind of media that they put out there. So that's why I put a trigger warning before me talking about this, because I do think it's important to warn somebody. You can't just force things upon people, especially when they are very much so material that can be harmful and you have an idea that it could be. So give a warning to that, which is why I think James Charles, before his photos, which I'll get into there's other responses that he got in a sec, which I think he should have put a trigger warning before that, and that I think really would have helped out. But some of the responses that I saw, from my point of view, put this idea that because because they have experienced certain kinds of violence, specifically domestic violence, they viewed the bruises and the bloody nose as an example of what that could look like, what domestic violence could look like. And so they projected their own experience onto those photos. And they said, kind of alluding to the fact that, this looks like, these can be triggering to domestic violence victims because it looks like things that they've experienced. And while I am very much so sympathetic to that view in terms of, their feelings are valid and their experience is valid, and being understanding that this is an experience that people can have, very much so, is something to consider. And thus, like I said, put trigger warnings before this stuff. And James Charles didn't do that. However, when you're projecting that because you experience this is what it looks like to everybody else, that's not necessarily the case. When I looked at those bruises, having not experienced domestic violence, I didn't see that as an example of domestic violence, because you can get a bruise or a bloody nose from anything. I mean, that's why it was in the TikTok trend of a mugshot to begin with, because people saw it in that context of, having to take a mugshot, which again could have been from, getting in a bar fight or some kind of fist fight. It could be, police brutality. It could be, you being arrested for public nudity and you fell on your face. It could be you being arrested for drunken disorderly conduct and, you being a mess and you just end up hitting yourself in some way. Like, it could have been a result for a lot of things that would result in the police apprehending you. And it could be before or after arrest, right? And so for me, I never really saw any other things on that because I don't have that experience to put upon those images. But these other people did. And I'm not saying that their experience, should not be considered and that, they should just sit and take it. I don't agree with that. Like, again, trigger warnings are really important. But the way that you interpret it is not the only way that's out there. And you can't use your trauma as a shield from any kind of criticism of thinking about something a little bit differently. And this just kind of gets me to another thing about Twitter that I just really don't like, because there's a lot of moral superiority as well as like using your trauma and your experience as a shield, where people shouldn't get to criticize you because, I am of this kind of identity. I have this experience, thus you can't really say anything about my argument. It's like, well, that's not how anything works. Like, you can have an experience and still be like wrong about a general idea. Like, for example, like I can have a certain kind of experience that's, really, really positive about being a woman in society. And I could say like, well, I haven't really had any problems with being a woman. So obviously there's no problems. There's an issue here. I can't project my own experience of being a woman, which, by the way, it's not positive. Like, as privileged as I have not always had positive experiences being a woman. As positive as I could be, I can't project that onto other people. Because one, I don't know them. They don't know me. I can't really speak for them. But two, general trend in society is that women are not treated well and that women are disrespected. And who am I to kind of supersede that? And even in this circumstance, going back to the example of, domestic violence survivors coming up into James Charles' replies, even domestic violence victims and people who have, experienced like violence don't agree on this. Like, there's a huge, difference in opinion there. And even then, like, what do you do, right? So to say that one victim's opinion and one victim's perspective should be superseded by other people, that shows that there is one perfect way to be a victim and one perfect way to see the world, and I really don't see that. And I don't understand how that could be, especially when you're talking about just depictions of violence in general. When he didn't even post anything having to do with the mugshot, it wasn't even part of the trend, because that trend, like I said, has a lot of problems on its own. But just having a bloody nose and a bruise, I don't really think that you can make a full big argument saying that that should never be depicted on the site. That is something I have kind of an issue with, especially when it doesn't violate Twitter's or TikTok's or Instagram's terms of service. And so now we're getting into this kind of, where do we draw the line kind of argument. And I don't really know. But even though I do agree that we need to, listen to victims and we need to listen to their perspective and try to figure out a way that we can best help them and navigate society, that doesn't mean that I think we should just completely unilaterally take what they say without any kind of discussion or any kind of nuance or any kind of understanding or questioning and just apply it unilaterally. I really don't think, one, that's fair, because like I said, not all victims have the same perspective or think the same way. But two, this is not a situation that is so cut and dry, and I don't really think that we should be treating it that way. I mean, for example, this brings into discussion something I had with one of my friends, where we were talking about how, trigger warning, I'm going to talk about like, general violence, lynching, etc. So one of my friends and I were talking about how there was a huge wide range of opinions regarding whether or not lynching should be portrayed in film. And I, as a white Latina, said I personally don't think it's necessary to get the message across. And some people, other people of color, and specifically with Black people, also agreed with me. However, there were other Black people that disagreed with that opinion, and that said, like, actually, I think it's very necessary to show that so people can really see the evils of slavery and understand just how brutal that time was, and often, still is to this day. So even then, there's like in that kind of a situation where you would think, based on your experience, especially since there are definitely a lot of Black people who are descendants of slaves and have a specific kind of trauma associated with these images, even that group of people does not agree on whether or not lynching should be portrayed in media and should be depicted in film, even if for the greater goal of, depicting a realistic situation. And I think just saying like, well, I have this experience and thus I think I'm right, and that's that. In that situation, that would be unfair to other people who are also marginalized having a voice and being able to discuss this. Because like I said, like this, like the mugshot, like just do, not the mugshot, like this, and the makeup effect of just putting bruises or a bloody nose, all of that is kind of a gray area. And so this is when we kind of bring in like James Charles' response. He asks a valid question of when does it get to be okay and who gets to be criticized for doing this? Because The Weeknd wasn't criticized for doing this in his art at all. For his album After Hours, he looked bloodied and bruised up, and he was smiling, and he had blood in his mouth. And in his performance on Saturday Night Live, he also had that kind of look about him. And there was even people in the Twitter timelines, asking like, is he okay? What happened to his nose? So obviously, people were concerned there, but I didn't really see any criticism of, him looking like that and not really depicting him actually being in some kind of altercation. But James Charles did it and didn't even have a caption, and didn't even, at least on Twitter anyway, didn't have a caption, just like posted his photos, but he gets a lot of hate for it, and he is seen as like glorifying violence. So where do we draw this line when it comes to entertainers and artists? And this is kind of when I thought the criticism of him, while I think some of it was, valid because the mugshot trend is bad, and I think, was necessary to hear, like, hearing domestic violence survivors talk about how this made them feel. Hello, editing. Rocky Raccoon here. So I just want to point out that it's not just about hearing, what domestic violence survivors and anyone who's a survivor of violence, sexual assault, are feeling, but also hearing about the potential solutions. And obviously one of the ones that I mentioned beforehand is putting a trigger warning before the content that you post. And that way, when people, are looking through their timeline, if they have those words muted or they have them filtered out of their timeline, thus those posts won't show up, then they won't see it. And so James Charles not putting that trigger warning in his post thus means that people are opening themselves up to actually seeing potentially triggering material when they never thought that they would have to do that if they put a block on certain terms. And James Charles not putting a trigger is irresponsible, and he's definitely in the wrong for that. And I think people showing that kind of criticism were definitely in the right here. And I think this is just a good way to make sure that everyone is somehow catered to, so that people, who have these words blocked never get to see it, but people that want to see it, and even if they may be triggered, they will take the chance whether or not they want to see that kind of content. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to point that out if I didn't make that clear. there was a lot of it that just seemed at an intensity that only James Charles would get, because he's James Charles. People already don't like him. People already have their opinions made up about him. And this is where I kind of get irritated, because I think he's done a lot to show that he's changed, and he very much so was trying to understand what people were saying. And I agree with his sentiment, though I didn't agree with how he worded it, that, him doing his makeup like this, didn't have anything to do with domestic violence, because just depicting violence is not depicting domestic violence, because there's a huge range of different kinds of violences, and they all don't get to be domestic violence. But people didn't really care about that, because it was James Charles jumping on trend, and it's James Charles. So, and I'm glad he took those photos down. I'm glad he did that. But at the end of the day, I don't know if he really got the kinds of questions that he wanted answered, because he was trying to really have a dialogue and really try to understand why people had this reaction to him and not anybody else. And still, people kind of took that as him just being really defensive, and I just don't understand why that could be when he's genuinely trying to have a discussion. He literally said basically that. And so to me, it's just, I don't understand why we can't have a discussion about this. And I don't understand why James Charles wanting to prompt this discussion, just because it's James Charles, that means he's being defensive, and that means that this discussion isn't worth having. And I don't really think that's true. I don't agree with everything that James Charles has done, and I don't agree with him doing this trend. I don't really think he should have. I thought it was a stupid trend to begin with, and it saddens me that he perpetuated it. I just don't think he understood what the implications were, and that makes sense because he's a really privileged person, and I don't think he always acknowledges that. And I'm not saying that just because I want to excuse him. I'm just saying that's probably where he's coming from. Doesn't excuse what he did, okay? But at the same time, I do think just because, he may not have understood and he could be in the wrong here, that doesn't mean there isn't still room for discussion. And I think people on Twitter need to kind of be open to that kind of discussion, because not everything is black and white, and not everything is going to be black and white, even if you've experienced trauma. People who've experienced trauma have a wide range of reactions, like I already said, and I think you should be willing to talk about these things. And I think people should be willing to engage James Charles, especially since this is not a black and white issue. And this is definitely an issue that I think does warrant a lot of discussion. This goes into a greater discussion regarding what is helpful and what is not, in terms of the kinds of images that we depict in our media. And honestly, I don't know the answers to that. Even somebody who has, experienced sexual assault, I can't begin to tell you whether or not I think depicting sexual assault on TV or any kind of media is helpful or good. I don't know. It's made me uncomfortable to see. For other people that I know that are survivors, that hasn't been the case. So I don't speak for all of them. And honestly, only time will tell on whether or not it would actually be helpful or harmful. But I know, even though with, my college degree, I'm not going to be sitting around here spouting my mouth, acting as if I know better, because I don't. And so I think it's kind of important that we all take a step back, try to figure out what we can all learn from this, and see where we can go from here. Alright, that's our first video. Be nice in the comments, please. This is kind of a long, unnecessary video regarding this. But yeah, like, comment, subscribe, I guess. I think that's what all the YouTubers say. So yeah, have a great day.